Hello, and welcome to a new episode of the BIMvoice podcast. My name is Petru, and today's guest is an architect with many years of experience in the AEC industry. He's also a web developer and software developer. He's very passionate about open source, and he's the only developer or the main developer of Blender BIM, which is an add-on for Blender for BIM, actually. Welcome, Dion Moult.
Good day, Petra.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, let's start. I'll give you the chance to introduce yourself, and you tell me with your own words how do you want to present yourself then.
Well, I was trained as an architect in Sydney and worked for a few years in an architecture firm, but I also have a background in software development and have contributed to many open source software projects. For example, the Gentoo Linux distribution, OpenStreetMaps, and more recently, I've been developing the Blender BIM Add-On, which is an add-on which gives BIM capabilities to Blender.
Okay, we can talk a little bit about this add-on actually. What do you mean by BIM capabilities?
BIM in this case is very specific. It refers to openBIM. So it's Blender, as you know, is a 3D modeling package, so it can already do 3D geometry. And if you want to add data to that, you can already add metadata to it. You can add keys and values just like most other 3D software. But that doesn't necessarily make it useful for the AEC industry. And so what I try to do is to implement the openBIM standards. So the most famous of which is IFC, which is created by Building Smart. And it's an excellent initiative to encourage vendors to allow data interoperability between their programs. And IFC is an ISO standard and has been for a very long time. So that is what we're bringing to Blender, is the ability to save the geometry and the data in accordance to the IFC ISO standards. IFC is not the only standard that Blender BIM implements. Another one would be the BCF standard, and there are a series of utilities around interrogating it, such as clash detection and issue management and so on, that are also built.
I see. But let's try to make it a little bit more clearer for those who don't know too much about Blender or who did not use it so much, right? So Blender is mainly a 3D modeling software, right, which is open source, but it's not very used in for engineering, right? It's based on meshes. You model using meshes, right? So how do we make that usable for our industry? Or do we only import an IFC file and we can add or edit some properties there? Or do we have the possibility to start modeling in Blender?
Yeah, so as you say, Blender was designed for the CG industry, not for the construction, engineering, architecture industry. And as a result, the way they model is using meshes. And most of the other software that we're used to don't use meshes very much. They use a lot of parametric objects. And although you can achieve the same thing in Blender, that is not the primary focus of the application. And as a result, there's a bit of a mismatch when Blender is used for, let's say, CAD-style geometry. But I think one thing to realize is that meshes are actually quite flexible and quite useful for many use cases. So the most obvious one is architectural visualization. There are already many ArcViz artists who are using Blender for that purposes, and meshes do a very good job. because of the ability to record UV coordinates for texturing. But it's less useful for certain other disciplines. And that's not to say it's not possible. It just means that you need to think slightly differently when you're using it as an application. It is possible to model an entire building very quickly with meshes if you're just acting as an architect, and there's not much that you'd lose. There are a couple of details you need to consider, like how arcs and circles are tessellated, but that's not insurmountable. After all, it's just a couple more parameters you need to store, like a center point and a radius. And once you start giving people the interfaces to store those parameters, at the end of the day, if you zoom into it and it's slightly tessellated, it doesn't really matter as long as the data is calculated correctly. A bit like how in an old style AutoCAD, if you zoom in, depending on your view scale, you would see it to be faceted, but you know that all the calculations are still going to be correct. So there have been quite a few initiatives. One example is Archipack. Archipack lets you parametrically create geometry in Blender that's related to the architecture domain, and that would preserve the parametric and the solids representation. Another example is in Blender BIM itself. So Blender BIM preserves parametric rectangles coming in and out of other software. And you can set extrusion profiles. So it's actually possible using Blender BIM to round trip geometry between between Blender, which is supposedly just a mesh package, and other programs like Revit or Archicad, and they're fully modifiable. You can move up and down the profile extrusions, modify the profiles, and so on, as if it were a native object. And as you can see, it is possible. All you need is to change the workflow slightly. There's also an initiative to mix Blender and Freecad using SphereJoc, which is the sort of graphical node-based equivalent of Grasshopper or Dynamo in Blender, which lets you manipulate Freecad-style geometry, which is the type of CAD geometry which you're more used to.
Yeah, but what does SphereJoc has to do with Freecad? Do they have anything in common, or do they work with each other? It's based on Freecad, SphereJoc?
No, SphereJoc is based on Blender, but there are some additional, correct, but there are some nodes in SphereJoc which allow it to integrate with Freecad's geometry.
Oh,
so you can effectively transfer geometry to and fro.
Okay, now I understand. Okay, what is Freecad?
Well, Freecad is an amazing free CAD package. It does a little bit of different type of geometry modeling. It's almost the opposite of Blender. So Blender is mesh-based and extremely free-form, artistic, very rapid style modeling that CG artists are very happy with. Freecad is the opposite. It's all about parametric, it's all about constraints, it's about a hierarchy, a tree of objects which depend on one another. So you might have heard of CATIA. That style modeling is more what Freecad promises. And that's very good and very appropriate for certain types of objects, but I would argue that for other types of objects, it's less appropriate.
So it's used mostly by mechanical engineers or product designers, but it's possible to use it also for civil engineers, right? Or for structural engineers. It's possible to make buildings in it, right? You have an add-on or something. They have some, I don't remember, workbench, I think they call themselves, right? There are some workbenches that you facilitate you to do different things that it cannot do natively, right?
Yes. So Freecad has a core application, which is then extended by a series of what they call workbenches. and each workbench specializes in a particular domain. So one workbench will add capabilities specific to architectural modeling. Another workbench will add capabilities specific to structural simulation or parametric sketching, or there's a lot out there. Unfortunately, I'm not the best person to speak to about that. You might want to speak to Yorick, one of the main developers.
Yeah, sure. Once in the future, definitely. But you say, like, from your knowledge, Freecad is mostly like a TIA or Inventor, maybe from Autodesk, right? I think Inventor does the same kind of the same things, like SolidWorks, maybe. But okay, what is open source? How do you define open source?
Well, the original definition of open source stemmed from free software. And nowadays, the term open source is much more popular simply because the word free software it can be a bit difficult to understand. But the original intentions did come from free software. So when we say software is free, we're not talking about the price of software. We're not saying that it doesn't cost you any money to develop or to buy it. That's not the point when we say free software. What we actually mean is that the software gives you freedom to use it for whatever purpose that you want, whether it is educational or building something, commercial or not commercial, freedom for you to own it, to learn under the hood, to tweak it to whatever you want to do, and then redistribute it to share the new capabilities with others. And that's the spirit of free software. It's the idea that we should share in our knowledge of how to build things so that we can end up with better products at the end of the day. And open source is one of the prerequisites for free software. So software, as you know, has source code, and most of the people don't look at the source code of their end user, but people who want to learn more about it and to modify it to improve it for their own workflow, seeing the source code is a requirement. And therefore, in order to respect the user's freedom when using the software, it becomes necessary to also share the source. And that's where the term open source comes from.
I understand. A few episodes back, I talked with somebody about, like we mentioned, like I also like open source, and I think, for example, in IT, they have so many possibilities. There are so many possibilities, right? There are so many programming languages. There are so many text editors, many softwares, right? That can help you if you want to do your job completely open source. You don't need to pay a dime. You don't need anything. Like, there are so many great resources, right? And this is something that it's a little bit a shame that in our industry is not like that. Like, our industry, as you know, it's very proprietary. And in a way, I not laughed, but sad a little bit about that, because we thought we don't have any alternatives. And after that, I start looking a little bit online, and this way I discovered Blender BIM and you. And that's why I took contact with you. Where I want to get with this is, like, it is feasible to use only open source solutions for a company to deliver a product on par with proprietary software. Are we there? It's possible to do that?
Before I answer that, keep in mind that there's a lot of variety in users. So although depending on who you are, you might be used to delivering BIM with parametric data, which in programs like Archipack and Revit and Tekla, and everything is 3D, and you can link it to spreadsheets and generate sheets, and there are scripts with Dynamo, and that might be your world. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind there's also a huge population which are still on AutoCAD. They're still doing just pure 2D. And so there are also people who focus on different aspects of the built environment. There are people who focus on GIS analysis, people who focus just on costing, people who do environmental analysis or lighting simulation. And so the question you get is free software there yet? Can you essentially complete commercial grade output with it? Depends on where you are in the pipeline. So for example, if you are a lighting engineer and you do light simulation, free software definitely is there. Radiance, for example, is an extremely famous lighting simulation software, and it is incredibly capable and is seen as one of the benchmarks to which other proprietary lighting simulators have to compete against. So in fact, free software in the lighting simulation world can be said to be ahead of proprietary software. Structural analysis, for example, now this year we're taking it with a grain of salt. I'm not trained as a structural engineer, but there are programs like CodeAster and Salomeka for CFD. There is OpenFOAM, and they are incredibly capable pieces of software. They might not be as visible to users due to the lack of marketing or the lack of training courses and user interfaces, but in terms of capability, you could say that it's definitely there. When it comes to visualization and modeling, you have tools like Blender and Freecad, and they are incredibly powerful modeling packages. So in that case, it is there yet. It's already there. And in fact, the ability of modeling in Blender far surpasses the modeling tools given in most CAD packages. Then you have the question, does it offer the same level of domain-specific modeling? You know, do I have the huge libraries out there of drag and drop a door? And that's when you start saying, no, free software is not yet there. We don't yet have those libraries. We don't yet have those parametric capabilities yet. They are growing every day, but in my opinion, it's not there yet. So it really depends who you ask. Documentation is a big issue. Traditional 2D documentation, there's LibreCAD and QCAD, which will replace AutoCAD. But when it comes to the 3D style documentation, it's not there yet.
Yeah. So it's a little bit like it's going to be a little bit easier for people who like to tweak things, to try different things, but it's a little bit more difficult for the ones like, yeah, I want to open my AutoCAD or Tekla and have my interface. I know I'm friendly with it and just do my job, right? I think this is also because, yeah, documentation. It's like you need to have the willingness to tweak a little bit, to try it a little bit, and you won't find baby steps. Not right now, actually. Yeah.
Correct. Not right now. What I discovered is that open source, you're right, is not common in the AEC industry, but actually there are lots of really small pockets that are really doing very cool things, but they're just hard to discover. So a group of us, actually first suggested by Dimitar from HOK, a big architecture firm, we came up with the idea of starting out with an open source architecture, but this includes all disciplines, a community of people who are willing to sort of push the boundaries and see what's possible. And there's actually a directory of free software which relates to open source, which relates to the AEC industry, sorry. And I think there's nearly or exceeding 100 programs on there, just that they're just not quite so well integrated. So there's still a bit of work to be done. But progress is being made.
Yeah, yeah. It's difficult to really compete with the paid solutions because, like, you have people hired for that, right? And here, people just use their own private time to develop this, right? And it's like we need more resources as well and more interested, right? It will definitely help. Uh, and because I think we get to a point like with the paid solutions, just knowing like I'm thinking from the perspective of a company, right? If they would consider like a company that it's it's working already, not a startup or a one person. One person might do that because they don't want to pay a hefty fee for Autodesk or something, right? But a company that is producing already to switch to completely to open source needs to be they must think twice because they like you have support, right? This is the thing with actually with the proprietary solutions. Like you have support, you have a company. If you get in trouble, you get someone to help you. You paid for it, of course, you pay for it. But with open source, like you need to fix it yourself or to wait until a solution is coming up, right? So I'm not saying this is bad, but I'm thinking like this might be a challenge for bigger businesses to integrate it. I know there are many companies, many architects using Blender in big companies as well, but for visualizations purposes, right? Not for the entire workflow, for all the disciplines, and for an integrated workflow, right?
Yeah, I as much as I do like open source and free software, I do have to say, to be realistic, I would not encourage big companies which already have a large percentage of their workforce on existing platforms to, at the moment, think that it's feasible to migrate. That this is not yet the time. The proprietary industry has had a huge head start, and we have to acknowledge that. And it will take a while for us to catch up. And we do lack the resources that proprietary firms do. But that said, you might be surprised by how much work can be done by a few motivated individuals. So I guess now is the time to wait and see. But there is still a scenario where it does make sense for a large company to start investigating open source. Not necessarily to replace existing workflows, but to be aware of how you can sort of push the boundaries, because the open source community likes to experiment, and we like to try pushing things that people might consider not currently possible. And if you really want to be on the cutting edge of technology, it is a good idea to at least be aware of what's happening in the open source community.
Yeah, that sounds good. You are doing this, right? You are trying. You are using this at a professional level in some cases, right?
Correct. So we have. I do know of an instance where completely open source software has been used to deliver a building from design right up until construction. So it is technically possible. I have also seen firms use purely open source software in a commercial environment for structural and CFD analysis and light simulation, as well as in GIS. So I have seen these things in use, and I've also seen them being pushed to the boundary. So, for example, the ability to create BIM models that contain all the data you need for light simulation and can be used out of the box for that, or how to generate construction documentation out of IFCs. Those are some examples of ways we're sort of pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
That's good. It would definitely help if would get more interest from companies as well to look and maybe try to support, contribute a little bit. because right now maybe it's almost non-existent, the support. But it's like, I guess, like you said, you might be surprised what a bunch of people might can do. It's you're right. If you cannot compare a team of people or a few people, few from different places of the world that are very passionate about something, what they do, with a team that is paid for that, right? So the passion and the willingness to achieve something really special, it's sometimes or almost all the time much important. It drives you much further to achieve much more meaningful things as well, and more at the same time. Okay, so we got a little a basic idea about the open source, and I will definitely make sure to put in the show descriptions all these resources, so interested people can go there and see what it is this about. Now, if we go back a little bit to the name and the meaning and the mission of this podcast, of my podcast, and namely BIM, how do you understand BIM? How do you describe BIM? What is BIM for you?
That's a bit of a loaded question because everybody has a sort of a different opinion. But I'll give my personal opinion, and that is that BIM needs to be structured data about a building. And that's the key word here. It needs to be structured. So, for example, if you are just having data about your building in a spreadsheet format, I don't call that structured. There is no standardization. It is not easily understood by a random person. They will have to understand your structure first. And unfortunately, that's what most of the industry is doing. If you are just purely developing BIM models using proprietary software and proprietary data formats, you are creating unstructured data, in my opinion, because that data cannot be then interpreted by anybody. They need to use a certain platform. They need to see how Revit or Archipack or Tekla, whatever, has organized it in their way. And very often, especially when you create custom attributes or custom parameters, the data becomes even more messy. So as a result, I don't see the difference between a typical Revit or proprietary model and somebody on an Excel spreadsheet typing things out manually. There's very little difference to me. Where I see structure is when people are able to produce data that complies with an open data specification. And there are a variety out there, but the most popular one is IFC. And so in my opinion, if you are capable of producing data that describes your building in an open data format, one of which is IFC, then I consider that to be BIM. But that is just my personal opinion. Other people will have many different interpretations, and there's no saying which is right or wrong. But in my opinion, for BIM data to be actually useful, it needs to be clean, and the only way to guarantee it is clean is for it to be in an open data format.
Yeah, I understand. So what you're saying, you talk about like a power BIM, BIM powered up or something like that. Because from the definition doesn't come that I don't understand that needs to be structured. It's about information, right? But yeah, like in order to be most effective to use it and to make sense, yeah, I understand. But what do you think? Why do you think we have so many meanings of BIM? Why didn't we get like a better definition of this when someone came up with this word or words?
Oh, I don't know. It's just more acronyms. Many industries like acronyms. It doesn't really matter what industry you're in. People have to realize that what we're doing now isn't that much different to what we've always done. If you have to document information about how a building should go together on a piece of paper, then now you're putting it in a digital format. There's the concepts are all the same. The ways of transporting and cataloging that information is slightly different, and some people think that certain approaches are better than others, and some are objectively more correct. But I don't see it worthwhile to debate one acronym or one buzzword over another.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's just like I find it a little bit dumb, if I can just plainly put it that way. That it's a little bit misleading and confusing for a lot of people, right? Because yeah, it's not like we know. I don't know you, but I've seen many limited description of BIM, and that doesn't help us to with the BIM adoption. Actually, that is one of the reasons why we still struggle, because there are still people trying to understand what is BIM. Some people just hearing the word, the acronym, they think, oh, this is expensive. Like, for example, some leaders or something in companies, right? Oh, no, I don't want BIM. BIM is too expensive. I don't have time to implement it, and I won't do it now. I'll do it later, after the others have done it, right?
Yeah, I guess the value is not so much BIM. The value comes in openBIM, because let's say you do things traditionally on pieces of paper. There are people who need information from your project, and the way for them to find that information is by looking at pieces of paper. So you say, okay, let's make things a bit better, and so we're going to put it all in a spreadsheet. And now it's a bit better because they can search and they can filter that spreadsheet, and therefore certain types of analysis become faster and faster. And this is the trend, that we want the data to become cleaner, more easily analyzed, more easily queryable. And the peak of that is openBIM. It's BIM data, which is stored to an international specification that all programs out of the box know how to interpret. So the sort of holy grail is a digital representation of your building that every single element has data that you can instantly ask for the most appropriate use cases. So somebody who wants to cost the building has all of the details he needs, such as areas and lengths and volumes, and counts and weights and things like that. Somebody who wants to do light simulation, every single element we know exactly. There is going to be a property stored here in that particular physical unit, and it's going to have a range between this and this, and it's going to store all of the data I need for me to extract out a lighting simulation out of it. And so that's the holy grail, that you drop in an element, and out of the box, that element has all the correct properties for quantification, for simulation, whether that's light simulation, fire simulation, structural simulation, CFD modeling, rendering, acoustic, and so on. And that's the holy grail, is that every element has all of the data relevant for all the disciplines right where you need it. We're a little bit far from that at the moment. Right now, we're just a step up from spreadsheets. We've moved from spreadsheets to proprietary databases. That's the level most of us are at.
Have you done that? Have you really done
Okay,
that
I
all
take
over
that
the
back.
world? No. Because there are places maybe in the world where it's ahead of that. I would say there are projects, not the entire industry maybe, but in Norway or UK or in United States, or maybe in Australia as well. There are cases where we done it a little bit better. But like you said, like if you take the entire planet, yeah, of course, it's you're definitely right. But I'm thinking databases. There are very many people that don't know what a database, engineers, I mean, or not only engineers. Like if you look from a wholesome perspective, like you include not only design, right? You include contractors, you include the suppliers, and you include the asset owners, right? Do you really think that everybody know what a database is? Or yeah, maybe they heard that word, but they are using databases instead of spreadsheets. I really doubt that. So okay, because we got here, what are actually now the biggest challenges? What do you see in yeah, like to get us to the next level, right? What do you see today as biggest challenges that we have in going there?
Good question. I think I think it's a cultural challenge. People are very complacent with the way things are already being done. They're very happy to, I guess, just use off-the-shelf things. And there is a time and place for that. But I think that many other industries are realizing that once you start putting it in a digital format, you can do so much more. And we need to start saying, having people in all of our companies that say, yeah, let's see exactly how far we can go with this digital data. And that's not a technical problem, that's a cultural problem. We need people to understand that this data is actually out there for you to manipulate, and you can build your own software, you can build your own tool chains, you can build your own ways of manipulating the data. And it will come sooner or later. We have school kids trained from a very young age to write in programming languages. So there will come a time where the entire youngest generation in the workforce, all of them will know how to code. And when you have people who know how to code, they will not be contented with the off-the-shelf software. They will expect to be able to use the computer as a tool to have the freedom to do whatever they want with it. And that's the sort of future that has already arrived in some other industries, but may not have arrived yet in this industry. So for example, software is the most obvious one. The software industry cannot function without open source. The ability for the average person involved in the software industry is so far out, and the culture is that they expect to be able to manipulate their environment. And as a result, they are at that stage. A bit closer to home, you have the GIS industry. Most governments give out GIS data in open data formats. And the next question is, okay, if we already have open data in GIS, why don't we have open data in BIM? And sooner or later, these same cultural changes of expecting open data sets, I suspect, will come to BIM, and the AEC industry. But first, it requires a cultural change. It requires people who are willing to tweak and play around and push the boundaries and experiment a bit more. It's a bit of it's a bit hard to describe. In software, you might call it a hacker culture, the ability to sort of build something ad hoc and tinker with it. And that's maybe what we should push towards.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But are you thinking like in our industry, what is one of the biggest challenges? I think it's because there are so many involved actors or parts in a process, right? If you want to develop a project or a building or something, right? Infrastructure project, there are so many involved parts. How do we deal with this? Are maybe some parts involved in the process that are doing better and or that need to get better to help with this, or are we all at the same level?
I don't know. I mean, clearly, we're not all at the same level. There are people in a project who don't use computers, right? There are people who will design a building in Excel and will succeed in doing that. And there are other people who will push the boundaries. So we're definitely not all at the same level. I don't know the answer. If I could step back a little bit, solving technical problems is relatively easy. Even if we did nothing, and sooner or later, there will come a generation of people who expect to do more with computers. There will be open data, there will be open BIM, even if we sat back and did nothing. I think it will come nonetheless. More importantly is knowing what we're doing with this open data. I mean, if you ask yourself, what does the world need? Does it need better BIM software? Is that really a worthwhile goal to pursue? I would say the answer is no.
No,
I mean,
no,
do I really
definitely.
want to be? Yeah, I mean, the answer to real problems that the world is facing is not the ability to build buildings faster. In fact, that's probably the wrong way. You should be building buildings slower. We have to go back to paper. You know, we 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 don't want that. We want to be building better buildings. We want to be building smarter. We want to be building wiser. We want to be building with better informed decisions. And that does not require faster tools that do things that you've always done, but faster. That instead, it requires cooperation. It requires synergy. It requires a culture of people who are willing to share the information they have and easy workflows to consider in the design process in an economical fashion. That's what we need to solve. And part of that is openBIM and open data standards. Another big part of it is open source tools and workflows that we can build those. But even if those two are in place, it still doesn't guarantee success.
Yeah.
The third part, or should I say the first part, because it should come first, is the culture, of working together and collaborating in what is an extremely interconnected built environment.
How can we cultivate this? How can we stimulate the mindset shift to build to plant the seed for a collaborative society or for a collaborative environment between inside companies, between disciplines, and between different stakeholders?
The full answer is, again, I don't know. That's a very difficult thing to do, but I think there are some good things to pursue. So the first would be the culture of transparency. So we should start expecting people to share their design process, to share their thinking, and and part of how to do that is to use the culture of open source and free software to give the freedom of any stakeholder to interrogate right down to the source level. So I guess one big part of it is transparency. There are some very interesting firms doing this already. There's Opening Design, which does all of their design. They do use proprietary software in their workflow, but the culture by which they do it is in an open source way. So all their designs are done in the open for the public to see. You can, just like Wikipedia, you can download their BIM model and edit it and send it back.
Really? What
Yes,
company is this? Where they operate?
the guy who starts it is Ryan Schultz, and he works in the U.S. But again, it's done in an open source manner, so the people who collaborate are all across the world, in many countries. So they're not a huge firm with hundreds of employees. Again, back to my warnings from earlier that it's not yet the right time for huge firms with hundreds of employees to shift to open source. But they have made that happen. It's called Opening Design.
Wow, that sounds really interesting.
There's also the Wiki House project, which is the concept of designing and documenting a house that the community can own and build. And you don't, the fraction of skilled labor is reduced to a small percentage. That way, the community members, for whatever the purpose of the house, it could be social housing, or it could be just a community project that was done in an open source way, and the community will own it. They know how it's all put together, they know its purpose, and they have a connection to the building. You know, they care about it. It's not just something that's sitting there because it makes money for somebody. It's sitting there because it means something to people. And I think, and part of what makes it so successful is that transparent process by which it was built. The community was engaged throughout the entire process.
Where did you hear about this kind of projects? In Australia? Do you have this in Australia?
I haven't seen one in my backyard, unfortunately.
No, but
I'd love to.
No, but I mean, did you hear about this kind of project being built in Australia or in other countries?
Let me check. I know for Opening Design, they have projects in the U.S., but I'm looking at my other screen now. We have the Wiki House, and there's one in London, one in other places in the UK.
That sounds like a good initiative, and I could definitely put that in the show notes. You can send me afterwards a link, and I can definitely put it there. Sounds definitely like something inspiring.
China, Austria, Netherlands, Christchurch, it's quite a few places.
That's something nice. We need more of those, definitely, and we can definitely help with that. Transparency, cooperation. Why don't we cooperate today? Why? Why? I think a big reason for that, a big reason. I mean in our industry, right? Because we have so many actors involved, and the rules and the culture. What culture do we have today? The culture of fighting each other, of pointing the finger to each other, right? How do we go from this there? Could be a good starting point to have better rules, like better types of contracts. I think the contracts, the way they are formulated, there are definitely they have a big impact, a big say in this. What do you think about this? Can we have? Do you know better working types of contracts than others?
That's not my area of expertise. I'm sorry.
No, neither mine. I'm not an expert at this neither, but I used to ask and I learned a little bit about it, and I heard many people advocating more and more for IPD, which is integrated project delivery. And yeah, because in a way it sets all the parts involved to cooperate from the start. Like it's not like design build or design build. But yeah, it's I think the last resort we go to, all the companies go to, is the contract, right? If they have something they don't want to talk about anymore, if they argue about something, right? They just go, okay, this is because you have that as a governing rule, right? So I'm just thinking, is just of course personal opinion, but smarter contracts with better smarter terms that can stimulate cooperation. But I understand there is quite some resistance for this, unfortunately. What do you think about standards? Contracts, standards, same area. You don't need to know standards, but I mean, like, are they helpful? Are they like proprietary software? What's your take on this?
Standards are necessary for structured data. The end goal is for our data to cooperate regardless of the software that you use to author it. And in order to achieve that end goal, one of the prerequisites is that you have a data standard. That way the computer can read and write it reliably. And for that reason, I highly encourage openBIM and open data standards. There are some data standards, and for this reason, the work that Building Smart is doing is really good, and I highly encourage people to get more familiar with the work of Building Smart. But there are two parts of this that I like to consider. There's open data, and there's open source. And they're not the same. So openBIM and open source are not the same thing. But I think you need both to create a standard, because a standard which can only be accessed using proprietary tools is limited by the abilities and the workflows of the proprietary tool. And so as a result, it doesn't quite achieve the end goal of being able to fully interoperate, because you can only interoperate if the vendor tells you that you can. If you include open source as well onto it, then an open data standard becomes much more powerful, because the tools can now be manipulated by people in the industry. So I do encourage standards. It's probably a good idea to know where your roll of duct tape is as well, because standards, as we all know, aren't a panacea. But in general, I think they are a good thing.
Yeah. But what do you think about, like, could we get to a point where we get open standards? Like, I mean, like today, if you want standards, you must pay for it. You must buy them, right? If you look for IT industry or for other industries, maybe you find more openness to that. Would that be something that would help?
Absolutely. So just because something is an open data standard doesn't necessarily mean that it is developed in an open source fashion. And so that's why I say it's good, but it could be improved by adopting principles from free software and open source. So you're right, many standards in the construction, architecture, engineering industry are paywalled. And in my opinion, that doesn't do many favors to the industry. It would be better if these standards were more publicly accessible. On the plus side, Building Smart's standards are publicly available, not behind a paywall. And so that is a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is open source. But at the very least, their documentation is publicly available.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I think I also think this, but yeah, it's easy to just say that. I don't know how easy it would be to migrate from, because yeah, these institutions they have a business model there, right? So not all of them will just go like Blender did from pay to open source overnight, right?
There are also alternative examples. So, for example, there is the BHOM, which I think they've called it the Buildings and Habitats Object Model, which is another open data standard for BIM data, but it's developed in an open source way, in contrast to IFC, which is developed in a more traditional institutional manner. And so it shows that you can do it. Unfortunately, they don't quite have the history and the let's just say the marketing department who can liaise with governments and chapters around the world, but it shows that these things do exist. Google, for example, has recently revealed their own digital buildings schema, which is also an open data format. So I'm not saying it's not possible. I do encourage where it happens, but at the current state of the industry, the biggest standard that we're dealing with is those presented by Building Smart.
Yeah, yeah, and this goes back to the culture. No matter what we do, we end up with the culture, with the need to open our minds, to change our mindset. But yeah, I think one way or the other is going to happen. Either, like you said, until when the new generation will rise and will just replace us, and they will just do it completely different, or there might be another alternative as well. Like the tech companies are starting to get more and more interest in the construction industry. So maybe if we are not willing to do it, maybe someone else will just come and replace us.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is not just a pipe dream. I think that it's out there. The way they operate, I don't think they would start putting money in something they don't want to succeed at. Is there anything in the open source world that we did not discuss about that you think would be important to mention for our industry?
I think I should mention OS Arch, which is a good avenue for people to start talking more about this subject of open source in the AEC industry and how to push it forwards.
Yeah, so a community for people who would like to at least to read a little bit about and maybe get involved as well. Why not? Right?
Yeah,
There are many ways. People, you know, I'm definitely sure that people have no idea how much can they help, even if they don't know how to code, even if they don't understand the software. Just review. There are so many ways to contribute to open source. There are so many ways. So doesn't matter if you don't know a way already. It's just nice to just start reading about, and you will find out. You can definitely help. Even just writing or reviewing, even giving feedback, it's very helpful, right?
absolutely.
Yeah. So are there any other communities or any other places, forums or something where people can read more about open source in AEC industry?
As said before, there are many small pockets of really interesting, fascinating things happening. What hasn't existed in the past is one place which tries to bring it all together, and that was the intention behind OS Arch. But OS Arch is sort of like an umbrella. If you are interested in a particular sub-project, like as said before, there's 100 packages out there you could possibly contribute to. It's not like you have to contribute to Blender or you have to contribute to Freecad.
Yeah.
If you wanted to, you could contribute to Radiance, to OpenProject, to OpenFoam, to Codaster, to QGIS, to LibreCAD, to QCAD. There's so many packages out there. And each one of them has their own forum. They might have a mailing list. They might have a community, and each one of them has their own culture as well. And I can't list them all, but I'm sure if you investigated each one of those individual packages, you'll discover their community. And there are lots and lots of places to learn more.
I see. What about BIM? Are there any resources you would recommend to someone who would like to learn more about this? Are any recommended avenues you have?
About openBIM? Yes. But in BIM in general, I wouldn't be the best person to recommend resources.
Yeah, we can say openBIM. It's fine.
But if it does come to openBIM, I can certainly recommend the Building Smart organization have a forums where you can ask questions. You can also ask questions on the OS Arch forums about openBIM. There's if you are more technical in nature, you can read documentation online. provided by Building Smart. If you want something a bit less technical, there is a wiki for OS Arch, which we're starting to write articles trying to explain these concepts and have a read through them. I mean, again, this is a very early stage, so let us know if there's an article you want to read about that hasn't been written yet, or if something's too technical or is explained poorly, let us know, and we can collaborate to fix it. And I think more and more people nowadays are starting to write their own articles online and videos and seminars on openBIM. And generally, there are a lot of countries have their own chapter, so maybe that's a good way to get involved as well.
Yeah. How can people get in touch with you if somebody wants to ask you a question or something? What would be the best way?
Just post on the OS Arch forums, and I'll check it on there.
Yeah. What about LinkedIn? You don't like when somebody is approaching you on LinkedIn?
Well, let's try and be a bit more transparent about it.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. Awesome, Dan. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion. I really hope that this is going to be a nice introduction for somebody who was not aware about what is happening with the open source in AEC.
And just remember, you don't need to know how to code to get involved. That's the most important thing. The people who are interested in this are people who are not just coders. A lot of us are professionals in our own discipline trying to do something a bit better in the built environment.
Thank you for coming along.
Thanks for having me, Petru.